All right. Welcome, everybody, to our next session. This is Punk, Pedagogy, and Play. And we've got four fantastic papers for y'all, and then another robust question and answer session. Just as a reminder, so if you want to ask a question, we're going to save the Q&A for the end. But during the talks, if you want to record a question in the Q&A in Zoom, or if you want to put it in the chat over on Discord, that would be a great place to log those questions, and then we can get those going at the end of our session. So our first paper is going to be presented by Bill White. So I'm going to hand the keys over to him.
Thanks. My name is Bill White. I'm a professor of communication arts and sciences at Penn State Altoona. And I was very glad to have the opportunity to think about what punk meant at the Forge for this conference. The book I wrote about the Forge that was published in 2020 described the Forge as a communication artifact. And one of the things that I noticed as I was doing that was the extent to which the Forge and the indie scene, indie tabletop role-playing games identified with punk. And there's a couple of moments there that sort of that I put up on the screen that express that notion. We're all punk here. You're punk rock. I'm punk rock. Let's unite. And the notion of a punk ethos shaping the Forge was very strong. And one of the things that also informs this project was some of the feedback that I got on the book, which was reviewed by two different sets of podcasters, and both expressed some dissatisfaction that the language wasn't scholarly enough. They wanted to be more erudite, more couched in the language of the academy. This particular comment, hey, maybe apply some Foucault to it. That'll make it better. And so I took that seriously as a prompt for this project to look at punk. And so I went back to Foucault's Archaeology of Knowledge, which is the place, like a mid-career place where he says, here's what I've been doing, here's my method, and it sort of attempts to refine that, and then he goes on to apply it and further shift it later in his career. But this is a place where he says, this is what I'm doing. I'm looking for a general history rather than a total history, or I see a space for a general history within the history that's happening now. And when you think about the distinction, or the distinction that he makes is total history is an attempt to describe the face of a period, the overall form of a civilization. He's using language that reminds us of how he anticipates or gets incorporated into the literature of postmodernity because he's using similar sorts of ideas. He says a total history is about drawing all phenomena around a single center. In contrast, a general history is interested in discontinuities. It's describing relationships between different, what he calls different series, and not only series, but series of series, right? To see what tables it is possible to draw up, right? So not a single center, but tabular form. And in reading about how he's sort of been taken up, or how some of these ideas have been taken up, it informs cultural history as distinct from political and social history. And that's the space that he's in. He also says this thing where he's like, oh, I want to be free from the anthropological theme, by which he means he's sort of tapping into the structure versus agency. He says, I don't think this is about agency, or he doesn't say that, but that's the implication that you can take away. What he does say is, but I'm not about structure either. I'm not a structuralist. This is my attempt to find a method that's located totally in the discourse, right? Just the discourse is what I'm looking at, and around which everything explains or actually describes, right? He's interested in description, the description of discourse. And so in doing that, he starts by saying, well, the new history has a bunch of methodological problems. The first methodological problem is coming up with a corpus or a corpora of documents or a corpora of text to look at. Ours is, of course, the Forge. And he says something interesting, right? He's like, okay, the old history was interested in documents. The new history is interested in monuments, and actually it's interested in transforming documents, things that have to be read, into monuments, things that have to be described. Here's an image from the book about the forge that shows the forge as a monument in the sense that it's a description of the shape that it forms when you look at threads posted in different forums with different topics and how those actually can be intervened in, right? The moderator, where each of those charts flat lines is where the moderators intervene and say, okay, we're not going to talk about this anymore. We'd rather talk about these other things and change the shape of the forge. The second methodological problem that he describes is the notion of sampling. Like, how do we identify statements? And he's interested in identifying. He says that he's interested in the archive, right? The archive is the place where you're getting statements, and so it organizes statements, but it also serves as a place where it determines that they don't accumulate endlessly, nor get lost in space. But ultimately, the notion that the archive is procedural. Today we might say it's algorithmic, right? It's the rules that establish what can be said and so forth. This chart just shows kind of the sampling process that I went through. I tried a Google search first, which was not terribly satisfying. It mixed in some other things that I didn't want to look at, and so I did. I just looked at uh, uh, the internal search of the Forge, which let me look at the last 2 years, and then going further back, I didn't look because of the limits of time. I didn't go any further back, and it only goes back to 2008 because of a server crash. To get earlier texts, you have to look at it, I'll say manually. You have to type in the URL of different threads and then see what you're looking for there. But in this way, I sampled and identified threads to look at to begin to tackle the remaining problems that Foucault offers, which there's three others and they're all analytic, right? It's where he lays out his operational language for how do you make sense of a discursive formation? How do you describe a discursive formation using the method that I employ? And so looking at punk as a discursive object, which is one of the conceptual terms that he employs, and he says, well, here's what you look for. Here's what you look for. And the underlying terms are his terms of art. Everything else is what what I saw that sort of fit what I thought were his definitions of those terms, right? So you can see surfaces of emergence, the idea that, oh, discourse is just this flat surface that you can't really see, right? You've got a monument. Now you need to begin to describe it. How does that description work? Well, surfaces of emergence. And I've listed here some of the places where those distinctions emerge. And one of the things we know about distinctions is they say what it is, what it's not. And so you can see some of the different uh, um, frameworks of distinction or what I would call topoi of distinction that emerge. Second, authorities of delimitation. This may be the only place where he succumbs to the anthropological theme a little bit, right? Ascribing some agency. There are authorities that within the discourse that have the authority to say, yes, this is what we're talking about. No, this is what we're not talking about. And so at the Forge, that included original posters saying, hey, I want to have this conversation. I want to talk about this. Frequent contributors, as indicated by the post count along the side, letting you know who's been here a long time versus who's a newbie or newcomer. And then to the extent the cult of Ron was a term of art that indicated the kind of preeminence that Ron Edwards had as the global moderator and owner or one of the co-owners of the Forge, who had started it as a project to talk about and gather up indie games. The final term that he offers is that Foucault offers is the notion of grids of specification, which is the idea that there are systems and intellectual systems that are used to sort of classify the ideas that are expressed in these other frameworks, other terminology, other surfaces, I guess is the best way to say it. The next term he introduces is the notion of enunciative modalities. Who's speaking? Who's allowed to use this language and whose use of this language is suspect. And so what's interesting in looking at these threads is the notion that it's about design, right? We're talking about game design. Yes, there's some notion of play and things of that kind, or play informs design, but the game designer is as the expressive subject, the person who is trying to say something about a game that they're working on, that sort of forms the center around which a lot of these conversations take place, particularly when we're talking about punk. The quote on the right is sort of signals another enunciative modality, which is Edward's role as global moderator, his attempt to sort of flatten the hierarchies of the discourse, ultimately with him as kind of its center, also emerges as a kind of enunciative modality, a kind of primus inter pares kind of role. So the and so the notion of the designer as enunciative modality calls our attention to the game as enunciative field, the place, and you can see the definition that Foucault offers for it, but this idea that it is, and this is where he begins to be interested in, or begins to show us his interest in discontinuity, right? The way that things change within a discourse, or within a discourse of formation. So the example of Tim Denay's Punk, which is a game that he designed. Hey, I'm designing a game called Punk. It's about punks. It's awesome. As a result of feedback and so forth that he got it, he later changed the title to Our Frustration. But then the notion that, okay, within a game as an enunciative field, as a thing that you're talking about, and that you're successively talking about, iterating differently, there's this notion that, okay, there's the game itself, and then there's its influences, the fields of concomitance, the things that it's related to or that are relevant to it. And there's also something interesting, what he called fields of memory. That is what Foucault calls fields of memory, which are things that we remember, but that we remember as wrong. We remember as either wrong turns or obsolete or somehow passé. There's the things that we're reacting against. So if field of presence is and concomitants are both the present, field of memory is the past, but in a particular kind of past, it's the erroneous past. And so in the case of Tim Denay's Punk, the game, one of the influences one of the things that shaped his field of memory, or shaped the field of memory in talking about this game, is, oh, they're doing it wrong. There's not enough punk in these games. There's cyberpunk, there's steampunk, but there's not punk. There's not enough punk. And then the other thing that Foucault calls our attention to is procedures of intervention, how you get these forms of succession. One of the ones he mentions is techniques of rewriting, but I think you can also see it in the criticism within discourse. That is the idea that the games are criticized and that criticism is intended to make it more the game that it is. And then, of course, I think it's important to point out how modes of publication and distribution are a procedure of intervention, right? The game isn't, it's not merely designing a game in your head or carrying it around in your notebook, or maybe that is its mode of publication or distribution, but paying attention to that, what people think it means to publish and to distribute a game is a particularly important, particularly for the notion of indie punk and what it is, where, what does it mean for a game to be indie, to be punk is important in expressing punkness, or the punk as a discursive object in this field. It's in talking about discursive strategies where one gets a sense of how discursive formations do actually form. And so what I've tried to lay out here is the framework for how Foucault talks about discursive strategies, where, and again, this is from the conversation surrounding Tim Denay's Punk, where he's responding to comments that say, oh, this isn't punk because it doesn't, express the vibe of, or express the aesthetic of punk or the ideology of punk, and his response and the way that he sort of tries to create this system for expressing what makes it not punk. The I just want to, beginning to wrap up now. He introduces the notion of the historical a priori, right? The idea that that it's that statements are made in a condition of reality against the context of previously made statements that is itself transformable, and so you can see attempts to undergo that transformation by sort of saying, well, I see it being used this way. Let's see what happens if we try to create a game that does it a different way. A final concept that I think is super important or that Foucault offers as really central to his idea is the notion of the positivity. Other people might use the word the concept or framework, but he calls it a positivity, right? It's the conceptual knot around which discourse is shaped. And so if you think of punk as a positivity, this is where we can begin to see, oh, it changes, right? This game, Kill Puppies for Satan, was reacted to as if it was like you can see a review come from a review. It says, oh, this is what a real punk game is. And because it combines or it knots together all of these different kinds of meanings related to punk production, punk attitude, punk play. And finally, right? Again, I've tried to go through this fairly quickly. So even if it's not a complete archaeology of knowledge, I hope you'll agree that it's a dungeon crawl of knowledge, where we can see punk as a kind of Foucauldian positivity that expresses all of punk's tensions. And I've used the term sublimated or sublimation, both in the sense of kind of elevation, but also a kind of vaporization. And that was particularly clear to me when I saw a comment that said, oh, well, what's indie punk is spending your own money to buy art. That's indie because it's not about making money. It's about spending money. And that felt like a shift from the earlier sort of notion of the amateur and individuality or the ideological commitment to punk. And so the place that I think I want to leave it is just how methodologically the Foucault's archaeology calls our attention to change, calls our attention to discontinuity by focusing our attention on the language that gets used, not as a philological reconstruction, but as a critical one. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our second presenter in the Punk Pedagogy and Play panel is going to be Susan Haarman.
All right, welcome, folks. Can everyone see me? We're good to go. Slides are up. Perfect. Hello, everyone. Susan Haarman. Just really quickly, I'm a scholar of educational philosophy and also experiential learning. And so welcome to Make Democracy Punk Again, tabletop role-playing games, John Dewey, and the radical possibility of Ludic civic life. So first and foremost, I would just love it if we could, if you're in the Discord, this is a great spot for it. What do you remember learning in any kind of civics class that you took in formal education? So any kind of civics or AP government class, just kind of drop it in. Anything you remember at all. What topics do you remember learning? Checks and balances, 3 branches of government, some nice factoids. Great. Thanks to contextualize that I don't remember taking any civics classes. Perfect. Just keep dumping on it. Never heard of the subject. In North Carolina, the importance of Ronald Reagan. I'm shocked that we're not looking at California on that. Wonderful. This is elucidates, I think, part of the issue that we're talking about today, which is one, for some of you all, you're like, I don't think that I had any formal education in civics. But 2, a lot of what we're seeing seems to be a lot of just factoids, right? Some systems, a few people highlighting like some process information at best. So a couple people. We do have a little bit of public discourse and some participation in democracy. And what I would say is, I think we all know democracy's in trouble. It's not doing well. And to a certain extent, that is a conversation that we have been living into for a while. So that line was Trump's election a Sputnik moment for civics education, right? That was referring to the first go round. And certainly events like January 6th have, I think, shocked us into a moment where we are starting to wonder, right, as democracy itself is failing, what sort of education, if any, are we doing to form folks to be democratic? And in most cases, I would argue the things that you shared, right, are fairly accurate, that at best, most civics understand education as we know it is, in some cases, sort of like a greatest hits of Supreme Court, some factoids at best, but certainly not anything that's actually functional, which is really, really difficult, right? When we are talking about, again, democratic processes, things that should be a lived and enacted form of government. But I would argue that some of this is also arising, some of the issues that we are running into with the failures of civic education, of which, by the way, there are no formal standards. So there's no formal national standard, at least in the United States, around what civic education should be teaching. Now, I'm not advocating, don't hear that as me saying I'm advocating for strict standards-based education, right? But just to note, we put standards to things that we think are valuable. So the fact that we have not moved forward to put forth standards in civic education should be, right, a sign as to what level it currently sits within the prioritization, especially of United States public educational framework. But I think, right, this is also problematized by the fact that what do we even mean when we say democracy? And so if you can, same thing in the Discord, drop your definitions of democracy. How would you define democracy? What do you mean? What does that mean? And to the comments, can you have a functioning democracy without an educated choice? There is some commentary around that. So we've got some participation, some majority rule. Everyone gets a vote, I guess. I love that. Hypothetically, that would be sort of a classic interpretation of it. Representation, equal say, voting. That's a common frame, right? We see an output of democracy is voting. Just keep dumping them in there. Too complicated and too many paradigms for a sentence, which would also argue that it's difficult to then, if we don't know what we're saying or it's too complicated, do we have a common understanding? I would love to introduce you all to a definition of education as put forward by John Dewey. So John Dewey, classical sort of foundational scholar of the philosophy of both education, but also an early psychologist and thinker as well, and also haver of excellent mustaches. His definition of democracy takes one, first and foremost, a complete and full step away from the idea of democracy as being understood as a governance structure, right? Because he pointed to the fact that a government can say it is a democracy and not be democratic at all, which is unfortunately a reality that many of us are living in and have been living in for an extended period of time. And a quick yes, not the library guy, that's Melvin Dewey, John Dewey, separate dude. But for Dewey, democracy is the one and ultimate ideal ethic of humanity. And to his mind are synonymous. That democracy was essentially people living together well. That the significance of government is it is meant to be a manifestation of how people engage with one another, and that democracy is fully and completely, right, a lived habit. It is the lived reality of communities that are in interactions with one another that are sustaining, helpful, and mutually supportive. Democratic habits create and sustain, and this most significantly are democracy. Democracy is the doing of democracy, not to the form of governance that came out of it. And again, he highlighted the idea of democracy as wider and fuller idea than can be exemplified in the state, even at its best. To be realized, it must affect all modes of human association, the family, the school, industry, religion. It was something that was a lived reality in which we were contained and moved upon. So his definition already takes us well and fully out of just this frame of which democracy is running and existing, and is rather this like messy action that is interacting and moving and interacting with one another. So why am I telling you about this old dead white guy, right? Which is normally sort of a absolute sin when it comes to academia. It's because John Dewey was punk AF. He truly was. All of this is in 10-point font because there's too much to list. But of note, this is an intellectual who not only thought the thought, but also walked the walk. He was best friends with Jane Addams. He helped form the ACLU, the NAACP, and later a lot of refugee resettlement organizations that were, amongst other things, responsible for getting Einstein basically out of Europe. He's consistently spoke out for labor rights. He is credited for essentially sort of pushing back against this incredibly passive form of education that was sort of standard at the time. His entire way of being in scholarship has been run through and consistently with a constant and continual questioning and upsetting of systems as we knew. He was a pragmatist through and through and believed that everything that we did in philosophy as we knew it had to echo forth in our lived reality and lives. Otherwise, it was fully useless. And so I think when we are looking for a better and more punk form of democracy as we know it, returning to the thought of John Dewey become incredibly helpful in this moment. And also to take a look at that mustache. I think that is so straight it circles right around to being queer again, which we all know is quite punk. So a couple of other things, if you're just unfamiliar with some of John Dewey's thoughts on education, I think this is a great intersection, both of his ideas of democracy, but then also education as well, is again, the high focus and specificity on both experience and imagination is both essential in education and democratic life. Education should be rooted into student interests and that it is a social process, right? We are not educated alone. We are educated in all forms and varieties of our life, but it has to be understood as also being something that is done in a social frame and also mediated through that. And that education is meant to move towards growth and generativity that opens up pathways rather than just the mastery of content. And there was a transformation piece as well. So if we're looking at his frames of education, well, again, re-engaging this conversation with civics, I think it becomes helpful. But what we have to return to, right, this earlier conversation of what, if anything, do you remember about learning in civics class? If we understand that democracy is a dynamic, embodied habit and relationships, that democracy is a thing that we do in our lives, that might translate into a form of governance, right? But rather is something that we do. Civic formation that is literally just focused on sort of the delivery of information that is at best some process information about how a governmental structure works and a little bit of history is not going to be functional enough, right? So I'm arguing current civic education is educating primarily for static governmental models and methods that do not reflect current reality, and nor have they done as such, and even more deeply, don't actually reflect a vision of democracy. And friends, if you're wondering when the hell do games come in, now they do. So I would like to introduce TTRPGs into this conversation. So you're a crew with which I do not have to explain tabletop role-playing games, but just a note to have that up there, especially if we have some folks who are primarily doing, whether it's analog studies or other pieces. But one of the definitions that I think are ways of framing tabletop RPGs that I really like, that I think is very helpful within this frame, is Montola's idea of it that tabletop RPGs are a continuous cycle of iterative reinterpretation of the world in a communications loop of the game, right? So the ways in which we are continuing to re-experience this. Now, I want to put a note in this to just quickly say I am not sort of the first person by any leaps and bounds who's been talking about games and civic education. Kat Schreier came out with an excellent We the Gamers book, actually during the midst of the pandemic, where she really highlighted and doubled down that play is a civic activity, right? And so this then can become both a place in which we learn about how to approach civics, but alternatively, like we can learn to be better civic animals as well. And she talked about and did a wonderful job of sort of like taking what few standards or ideas we have for civic imagination or for civic education, really running them through sort of a comparative and synthesized frame and highlighting kind of 3 different domains of real world knowledge and action, community and connection, and critical inquiry and critical thinking, and highlighted sort of how games can address or really level up and provided some exemplars around that. As we see very often in game studies, almost all of her examples were entirely video games. And so again, great work, well done, but I think it also still plays into this problem that we sit in of Kat's work is excellent. It's still not addressing the system and the definition of democracy that we are educating for, right? Games are great for content delivery. And we've seen some tabletop games in which those are very effective. The game Caucus Masters is sort of hilarious, by the way, if you're interested in that. But we're still running into the same problem that even if we put a ludic framing around this static form of democracy that we're educating for, is any real change going to happen? And so I argue we need civic instruction that doesn't replicate the same passivity and distress that often happens in the classroom over and over again, right? We need something that is more dynamic. We need it to mimic the democracy we hope to educate into. And so my claim and intention is that tabletop role-playing games are a means that align with the ends of a civic life that is specifically rooted in John Dewey's conception of democracy. And this is the key point. If our understanding of democracy is something static, then we will continue to replicate these same systems. Dewey's frame that breaks us out of these structures and get us into relationship, that sees democracy as process, habits, interactions in a community, and not just a form of governance, gets us to something that is both more needed in society, but demands, right, an instruction methodology or forms of learning that are far more dynamic than anything we are getting in traditional schooling. And I think when we see it through this lens, tabletop role-playing games become incredible tools to facilitate what I would call a ludic pedagogy of democratic civic life that goes beyond the translation of content, which is lovely and thoughtful and helpful, but gets to this essential ways of living together, habits and skill building that we need to build a democracy on. And again, just sort of opening this up, my sort of broader definition of the ludic pedagogy of democratic civic life holds out a couple of things I want to touch on. One, it takes an auditelic approach to citizenship. And that is that the reward of being a citizen, and I use that broadly, that is not sort of a formal frame of documentation, but really to be in and participate in a community, is its own reward. Being in the community is its own reward. But it prioritizes committed collaboration with others, imaginative and emergent approaches to problem solving, and two, I think this is a really essential one, the ability to critically negotiate a system of power. Frame this up because we'll be pulling some information for this in a moment. So the Lippmann-Dewey debates are sort of a cornerstone of some civic dialogue that may be familiar, especially to some of our folks in media studies. But basically in 1922, Walter Lippmann wrote a book called Public Opinion that basically said, everyone is too stupid, too dumb, and too easily influenced by the media to be able to make decisions for themselves. We need experts to come in and fix things, especially government. Which can seem ever so tempting, but need I remind us of Doge and everything that happened earlier. Dewey wrote the book, The Public and Its Problems, in response in part to Lippmann's Public Opinion, where he said, again, democracy is not just about decision-making, it's about public engagement and the education that occurs within. It's not just about getting the smartest person in the room, it's about getting people in conversation with one another. And argued the public is misinformed. That is a thing that is a reality. He's not denying the reality of this, but instead, the solution is you need better education and you need participatory communication. Those are the elements and pieces that needed to occur in elite control. And so one of the things that he lifted out, which is I think is a really key conception for me as I understand the intersection of tabletop role-playing games as being a place to sort of open up the space for educating for a democratic way of being, right? Is he talked about publics. Publics are what happen when people come together to recognize shared consequences. They can have differing motivations, different values, but when two people or more come together and say, hey, our consequences are shared. What happens to me is affecting you as well. And how do we want to move forward for this? That is the unit upon which, again, social change occurs and moves forward. He also highlights that publics essentially are rooted in this process of collective reflection. And it comes together through, again, shared experiences and communication. When we talk and discuss with one another, when we share consequences, that's where we come together as a public. We decide what we want to do with that and move forward. And the other, I think, thing that was really dynamic is he was very big on publics come and go. People will come together, work on something together, and then they might stay affiliated and they might move apart. And they can be as small as basically 2 to 3 people. They can be as larger units, but the communication element and the shared significance of consequences were absolutely essential. And again, through these responses with others that a person makes his own activities, he comes to know what these mean in a social terms and the value that they have is reflected back to them. So this feedback loop of shared consequence is essential to understanding what it is to be in community. And I think, right, that is this key experience of shared consequence and impact, and what Sarah Stitzline would call shared fate, that is so evident when folks are playing at a table together in a tabletop role-playing game. A party is a public, right? It only takes one time for one of your fellow party members to be goofing around at the table to then set off a chain of reactions that everyone is sharing the consequences for, to both have you thinking more deeply about the impact of your own action, right? But also sharing in the consequences of others. The other thing is there is a constant and ongoing sort of negotiation around consensus that is happening within a tabletop role-playing game. People come in with their own, whether it's their characters or themselves, their own goals, and they're having to keep that in constant tension with both the party that they're working with and negotiating with, but a world in the form of the GM that is giving them constant feedback. They're seeing what happens through their own actions. They are seeing that implication. And again, I would say, like, Davison's conceptions of citizenship is, I think, really helpful in this. So much of one's own ability to occupy the role of citizen comes from the corresponding ability to envision the larger community. In our increasingly fragmented and isolated life, the real, very quick feedback that happens when we are envisioning ourselves in community and seeing the impact of that in very dynamic ways, I think becomes very, very helpful. And again, within games, fictive worlds have the capacity to expand the players' imaginations of communities in which they are situated, whether it be as small as the community of the party or the broader world of the game itself. And so we have this deeply educative experience that can be framed around what happens when my goals, needs are caught up in yours, but that is a living and moving negotiation. The other thing I would say is, from the framework of sort of how we are looking at civic responsibility, we are doing contingent consensus building, right? In a world where political division is massive and huge, we are continually having people negotiate what it means to come to difficult consensuses, right? And having them be contingent, having them to then move on and keep doing the process over and over again, which sounds like democracy and governance to me. But very often when we were talking about that skill, we simply talk about teamwork. That's what we're talking about. And I think instead we need to talk about and elucidate to people the ways in which they are learning to build consensus. They're learning to equip themselves with the skills that can feel very foreign, especially when working within these broader frames. Other piece, imaginative and emergent problem solving. You're a crew that I need to explain this less to, right? But these games give folks constant and continual opportunities to think about different ways of being. Which, especially within a democratic frame, becomes a deep invitation into finding, right, moving beyond the static ways of proceeding. And just a reminder, I think Laycock's great book on D&D really highlighted the ways in which he reminded folks that the experience of playing tabletop games really sort of would introduce them to the idea of that, like, realities are socially constructed. And so what happens when that then translates to, again, questioning those broader realities as well. And so I think that becomes a helpful frame. Again, I think you all are a crew, which I need to sell this on less. Again, we have to be able to create something better than we have to do good civic work, right? We have to do that. And until we can curate imagination, I think, and especially in this current season, like, you know, it's the classic line, democracy is a terrible system, but it's the best we have. Right? We have to do better with this terrible system that we have. And then finally, I think this is really something where I think tabletop RPGs do this really adroitly in ways that I think other, and again, there are dynamic ways of doing civic education, especially, but tabletop RPGs provide folks with a lot of incentive to learn how to critically negotiate a system of power, right? Which is that dynamic of not just saying we're going to burn it to the ground and scrap it, but to say, how do I learn how to negotiate these rules? Either to then question them, trouble them, problematize them, but also, like any good rules lawyer, good pro bono rules lawyer, how do I make this system something that I can use to my own benefit? How can I make this system that is, to a certain extent, constrictive, something that can move us forward? The location of which you are within the rules, learning to negotiate them, learning how to use them becomes very helpful. And again, we're all pretty familiar with Fine's frame analysis, but I also think Montola's work around how power shows up in exogenous, endogenous, and diegetic lenses through games is helpful, because it can also be a framework through which we understand negotiating political action. Because there is a level at which, right, if you're trying to advocate, right, for a local organization that's trying to get a permit for a shelter for folks who are experiencing housing insecurity, and you're running into a lot of sort of like NIMBY concerns, you can approach that from sort of a wide range of lenses in order to do successful political work, right? One is that there is this sort of like larger sort of exogenous, broader, the moral, like this should happen, this is important, this is essential, right? And then there's the very practical frame of like, there are permits that need to be filled out, and there are city meetings to attend, and there are places to go. And then there's the very like person to person zone of, I know this about the people that I am in a neighborhood with, what they care about, and how to negotiate and do that well. And having the absence of knowledge in either of those areas, I think, can stymie us both in forming more thoughtful ways of being, but also negotiating a system of power that inevitably is usually going to exist in the communities that we're in. And then just as a subtle reminder, right, to show that I think these experiences build some skills. If we all remember the OGL crisis, never try to dump or sneak something past a group of people who spend all of their time, in many cases, getting into the weeds around the fine print of rules. It will often come back to bite you. But to say that I think the community's deep engagement with their own capacity to sort of know, interpret, and be thoughtful about these rules is also a way to remind people of the capacity and power that they have as citizens, right? We forget this. And the importance of utilizing that. It can be very easy, especially when democracy is not functioning, to believe that you are sort of existent and all these things are occurring to you. Now, I also want to acknowledge that that's read through the prevailing frame of a lot of identities as well. But also at the same time, we have, right, or for many of us, we have a tremendous amount of power. How are we using it? And the need and importance of doing so. One sort of final note is that I think Dewey's attitude, he called mutual adaptation, and said it was sort of this really essential and important piece when thinking about anything as an educational tool, is that there is no such thing as something just having educational value in the abstract, right? You know, so his famous line was, "You don't give beefsteak to infants, and you don't teach trigonometry to toddlers," right? Like, you have to think about context. So I am not sort of automatically saying that like every game you will ever play, every tabletop game will have sort of an educational value, but to think specifically about our current moments, folks who are learning, the things that you want to do, I think Dewey's frame of democracy, if we shift towards that and also utilize his own attitudes towards the world as being capable of educational tools, help us to start asking these questions of where are we seeing untapped educational values? Where do we need to start bringing these into situations, and not just say, this is a game that works well in the traditional classroom, but rather the experience of this game can reshape, right? Is the experience of these games are educational spaces to begin with, right? So rather than just saying we're going to shove these games into the formal civics classroom, how do we understand that what might be happening at your local adventurers league in so many ways might be an experience of democracy and might be a place and space for folks to leverage and move forward? If I have a quick moment, what I would also just say is one other note that I think can be sort of very helpful to consider. Dewey made a distinction between government and the state. Government was just the structure of government that you were in, and the state was what happened when these structures of essentially society that were doing a lot of the administrative labor or work were serving the needs of a public. So a government might not be a state, but when the systems and structures were moving towards and being attuned and attentive to publics, then they were actually a state. And so how do we have an understanding, right, of the state does not exist without publics, right? You might have a governance, right? But like a state becomes a state because publics are being served. A reminder too that like GMs are constrained by the pure necessity of having players. There are many a GM-less games, right? But if all your players get up and leave the table, the game has essentially fallen apart. And that exceptional power that is held by the GM is stewarded, arguably. It's a stewarded power that the players themselves have handed over. How do we continually remind ourselves of the moments in which we need to leave the table, or the moments in which we need to flip the table, right? To ask these questions and to do these things. But it can be so easy especially in moments like these, to feel that there is nothing that we can do. So
And
cannot.
Susan, we are at time.
Okay, great. And that was it. Just a quick thing, if you're interested in having more conversation, I'm still doing research on this. If you can give that lovely QR code a scan and want to give me your thoughts and opinions on the intersection of tabletop RPGs and civic habits, that would be great. Thanks, Megan. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's me.
All right. So our next presenter is going to be Georg Wendt.
Okay, I hope you can see my slides and hear me perfectly. Thanks. My name is Georg, or George if you prefer. And off the top, my apologies for the lack of a camera view or more detailed personal information here on stream, but you can find more about me on the conference website or on Discord. The topic of my talk is critical gaming pedagogy, in particular, critical gaming what critical gaming pedagogy might look like if we aim to raise our students' critical consciousness and adopt a position of resistance towards co-opting or subjugating forces. I mentioned here big tech's increasing insertion into schools to the detriment of schools' autonomy when it comes to individualized learning environments or their students' data, for example, as well as the recent encroachment of quote-unquote AI into educational settings. And at the same time, I'm restricting myself here to somewhat readily available board games that, yeah, for economic and familiarity reasons. My talk emerges from my PhD project, in which I aim to develop a framework of critical video game literacy that understands the relationship between texts, meaning making, and power in order to undertake transformative social action that contributes to the achievement of a more equitable social order. And importantly, this means that I understand critical as in critical consciousness and not critical thinking. After all, so I hope you can see my slides totally. This means that instead of using games to merely teach students information about human rights and such, I explicitly model my framework on Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy, where a notion of oppression and a call for action is already part of the package. And still, this idea of critical thinking is favored significantly in various educational competence frameworks. But as the critic Andrea Longchu probably puts it best, the generic radicalism of critical thinking first and foremost spares the academic the labor of defending the actual political beliefs. So how can we help students develop their critical consciousness? Here I tend to agree with Cameron Kunzelman in that players need to be placed in a subjective context in which visual and audio aesthetics and mechanics produce some kind of change in that subjectivity, and the subsequent critical modifications attempt exactly that and aim to bring about a change of subjectivity through their mechanical changes. I situate these modifications within one of two broad and oftentimes overlapping camps that I've sorted existing literature on gaming pedagogies into. That is the critical engagement with already existing materials on the one hand, be it serious games or commercial games, and the fabrication of new material on the other, to specify the aforementioned modifications to existing games, the variants and homebrews of the self-same, up to the design of entirely new original game prototypes of fully realized student games. And in this talk, we will focus exclusively on mods. So here are three existing examples, followed by one of my own concepts for the classroom. Let's start with the very well-known Monopoly, which basically models the competition for property and money in a laissez-faire capitalist system, with the implication that every person has the same access to upward mobility on the same level playing field with the same opportunities to become an extortionist landlord or lesser. And Francesco Crocco's critical modification here is to split students in teams with different amounts of money, land, and privilege to incorporate class inequality in Monopoly's gameplay. And in Crocco's experience, students pre-game often believe in success being the result of merit, only to become somewhat disenchanted after engaging with this modified version of Monopoly. Greg Loring Albright's attempt is similar. Here we're dealing with Catan and its fictional island empty of indigenous life. Margareta and Thomas's earlier talk discussed this along with an invention of their own. And Loring Albright rectifies Catan's terra nullius myth by introducing semi-nomadic people to Catan as a way of offering a counter narrative. A third and also similar example would be the Eurogame Puerto Rico, whose mechanics reflect the broader imperialist logics of colonialism and the slave trade. Critical modification that is offered by David Mesty here simply changes the game's temporal setting into post-slavery 1878 and introduces mechanics for paid labor. I am somewhat undecided, honestly, whether this mod really addresses the colonialist connotations of the original text or merely circumvents it, but I find this contrastive strategy intriguing nevertheless. And then last but not least, I want to introduce you to my own concept, a critical modification for the game of life. As you probably know, the game of life models a chance-based materialist journey from youth to retirement and centers on the accumulation of wealth. In 2007, game designers at Hasbro were asked why money, and they conceded that whenever they tried to make a new edition less about money, changes then were, quote, really complicated, and therefore even new editions barely deviate from this centrality of cash. And just as in Monopoly, the game of life neither considers systematic injustices nor privileged populations. And my mod tries to address this through the game's central spinning mechanic and several rule changes. If you have never played this board game before, one of the most striking elements is its use of the spinner that you can see on the right now to spin numbers from 1 to 10 instead of a die. This barely changes the game's chance aspect, neither mechanically nor ideologically. The game still implies that luck plays a significant role whether people come out on top or get swept under in life. And in my variant of the game, there are 3 player classes along the axis of gender, race, and class. And these 3 classes are distributed among players. The group with the greatest privilege and financial security are white upper-class men who are allowed to now spin twice and pick the preferable of the 2 spins. One of Game of Life's biggest decisions early on is whether you want to go to college and have greater career options or start work life immediately. And our rich man here does not need to worry about student debt thanks to generational wealth, and receives 3 career cards to pick from after college. If he stops on an action space where he would need to pay a penalty, for example, taxes, this too can be resolved by spinning. Even numbers means that the debt is paid for by the bank, a 50-50 chance on a bailout, if you will. The white middle-class woman class of players then becomes the new baseline. Regular rules apply here, although in my 2004 version of the game, she would still be able to pick 3 career cards after college instead of the 2, but Hasbro seemingly considered this to be too fantastical for new editions. and so do I in my modification. And then we finally have an underprivileged class represented by a Black lower class person. For them, college loans are doubled to address how Black communities are disproportionately impacted by debt. The impossibility of taking on a loan when buying a house to highlight mortgage discrimination, as well as a penalty to be paid to the police after spinning nines or tens as a nod towards institutional racism and racial profiling. These are, I admit, crude and simplified means of rendering these large and complex systems of oppression playable to students. And even with these modifications, the play experience is still generously balanced in the students' favor. They are unlikely to accrue massive debt or experience job insecurity or anything of the sort. Yet I believe that the purpose for raising critical awareness and developing a critical consciousness, even if they are not without complications. And I have collected here a set of what I believe are the most significant positive aspects of using critical mods as liberatory pedagogy. That is, a critical mod enables a contrastive play experience for players that are familiar with the original rule set, with the game, and the attempts of then running their usual strategies might no longer be possible or have a positive outcome. Then pedagogical interventions like these are also evocative of Jack Masirov's disorienting dilemma, a conflict in which a student's previously held frame of reference is challenged and ideally brings about a constructive act of imagination. As well as the concept of simulation fever by Ian Bogost, which describes gaming situation where the game simulation is at odds with a player's subjectivity and therefore hopefully also persuades them to interrogate the game experience, as well as Anne-Marie Schleiner's broken toy tactic, meaning a rupture in the game that catapults the player outside of their comfort zone. In our case, because the competitive play experience has been deliberately unbalanced and, well, somewhat broken. And finally, the introduction of homebrewed rules and mechanics may invite further game design thinking and research. There are a set of disadvantages, however. First and foremost, before playing a critical mod in class, I believe it's important to interrogate student beliefs on what games represent for them in general. I list here commonplace and reductive stereotypes, such as games being all about fun, all about winning, or the egregious claim of apoliticism, and suggest that these should be addressed and challenged in pre-game discussions. Second, critical modification can only change so much within the capitalist, racist, or discriminatory logic of the base game. With the exception of maybe total conversion mods, I am afraid that remnants of the original designer's ideology will persist throughout. And then finally, and definitely most crucially, any critical mod that attempts to model systemic injustices necessitates an instructor's care and nuance in not perpetuating stereotypes or even alienating students who will identify in diverse ways and are affected by discriminatory forces themselves. Here it is important to emphasize how white supremacist capitalist patriarchy loves to frame its systemic unfairnesses as the personal failings of the individual. In other words, it's important to stress to students that gamified examples such as the black and white debt gap are not caused by Black individuals, but that the system as a whole is fucked. Thank you so much for your attention and having me be a part of this amazing panel and conference. Here's a list of my references, and I'm already looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And just as a reminder, before we get into our last paper, we're going to have our Q&A session afterwards. And so if you have some questions you want to queue up in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, you can go ahead and click in there and add your questions. You can also put them into Discord if you would like, or into the chat, and I'll try to kind of monitor all three. But our fourth and final paper in the Punk Pedagogy and Play panel will be presented by Jason Cox and Lillian Lewis.
Thanks, Megan.
Hooray. So here we are with Seizing the Production of Meaning. These are your punks for today. The other people have also been punks, but we're the punks for this moment. My name is Jason Cox. My pronouns are he, him. I'm at the University of Toledo in Toledo, Ohio, where I am an associate professor of art education and the head of the art education program.
Hi, and I'm Lillian Lewis. My pronouns are they, she, and I'm at VCU, assistant professor of art education there.
And I did actually want to start with this real quick to say, like, obviously, we are people who are inhabiting institutions. And so it's tough to be punk there, but punk is about resistance to authority. And those institutions incentivize isolation, they discourage change. What this presentation is partially about is an attempt to resist that. So here's our big old manifesto. It's basically the same thing if you look on the program as what's written there. What we're talking about is the paradox between creating a game, which was Mantles in the Museum, that engages in the democratization of criticism and curation in art museums, while also running headlong into financial, logistical, and institutional challenges that prevent that game from being circulated. We're going to explore some of the reasons and some of the reasons we think exist about that. And then we're also going to talk about how we're going to subvert that and get around it and make things better, or at least try. So first of all, Mantles in the Museum. If you look on the bottom left there, you can see the link. We have presented on our game many times. I'm very proud of our game. Please do look it up and play it. But the short version is that it's an immersive live-action role-playing game where players take on the role of influential critics who must select 3 works from a museum's galleries to send it to an international exhibition hosted by UNESCO. Each character in the game embraces one of 5 interpretive frameworks for evaluating and understanding art: expressionist, formalist, imitationalist, instrumentalist, institutionalist, which they are expected to represent to other players. Through this experiential method, players learn to participate in polyvocal narratives about, through, and in works of art. So we use this actually in our classes still. It's a useful tool for teaching about art criticism, because a lot of times students enter in without feeling like they have a voice, without feeling comfortable, without feeling like they can say anything against the little placard that's right next to the work of art. So the game does a couple of things. It introduces those tools. It encourages the players to discuss works of art, which is something museums say they want, rather than just going and staring for 6 seconds and nodding and moving on. It nurtures the creation of a community of inquiry, and it challenges the institutional control of value and meaning, specifically the one the museum normally establishes. But in trying to get this distributed, we ran into some walls repeatedly. First of all, there were always questions about how profitable it could be. The idea that the only thing that mattered would be how much money you could make from it. There were things about meaning. Is it okay to just have the students making up their own meaning? Why not just tell them the meaning the museum has? In which case, the influence of some of the institutions becomes the question. How does it relate to the collection? This could be the collection of art. This could be a collection of publications. This could be anything. It's a body of work. How does this connect to what we think makes our value, our possessions? And then lastly, how does it speak to, I wrote insert genre, but specifically it's about expertise. It's about the particular niche someone has separated out. Now, those walls are in opposition to institutional goals for the things that me and Lillian really interact with the most. Art museums, who again and again, their missions say they want to use their collections and programs to enhance or transform the lives of attendees. Schools say they want to cultivate lifelong learning, social responsibility, and the skills necessary for a student's professional goals. And academic publications want to partner with academic communities to advance knowledge in scholarly fields. They are noble goals, but if those are the goals, why do the barriers still persist? Our game's awesome. It's effective. Everybody loves it. Those barriers are dumb. Seriously. So there's a couple of reasons for it. Firstly, the museums, at least in the United States, there's some variety depending on the country, prefer engagement tools that are specific to their collections and under their control, because their focus is on the number of people they can bring into the museum and the establishment and reestablishment of their own authority. They don't really particularly want you to question that. They want you to have a good time, come back, bring your friends. Schools, both secondary and higher education, discourage the use of spaces not under institutional control and dictate where learning can take place. This was talked actually a little bit during the keynote, and preventing educators from having the opportunity to experiment with our game. So if it doesn't count unless it's in the classroom, or if it's more meaningful if it's in the classroom, or what have you. And then academic publishing. Academic publications often attempt to establish a specific niche to differentiate themselves from their competitors. Very few art education journals speak to the intersection of visual art and games, save in a special issue, and even then limit the content to academic analysis. Obviously, there's the occasional exception, and all love to analog game studies, but in art education, that's generally what we're looking at. So, what do? I'm going to pass it on to Lillian, and she'll tell me when to advance the slide.
So for a little background on this, we started working on Mantles in the Museum counter-narratives to address some of the things we talked about here. We also had a rare opportunity in art education to publish an article about Mantles in the Museum, and we published that article in the Journal of Social Theory in Art Education. The JSTAY editorial board feedback generally was pretty positive, and I think they were excited to have something like this, and they were willing to work with us. And this was the second submission. We tried it in another journal, and they said we can't work with it. Basically, we can't work with game format. But they said, you could be a little bit more radical here. This is like you're encouraging art criticism, but how do you get more critical? And so that was just the encouragement we needed to lean into the sort of punk version of this game. So that's what we did. Next slide. In our revision of Mantles in the Museum, we are focusing on these three main goals. And first goal is to prioritize suppressed perspectives. I've worked in several art museums. So I was a curator of education in a museum in West Texas, and I worked with several other art museums in Texas. And there are certainly art museums that are making some progress in terms of thinking about critical frameworks. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, pardon the metaphor, but many museums are still really struggling with things like how do we do something that decenters Western aesthetics and discourse, or do we at all? And in a way that's not just superficial or tokenistic. And particularly given that art museums tend to be places that are heavily reliant on just looking at images, and there's not a lot of didactic information or tools within galleries. And if there are, they tend to focus on sort of majoritarian narratives. So we want to try to think through like how can the game bake this in, and to shift aesthetic perspectives. And then we also wanted to decenter objects and architecture along the same line. So while some students have had experience, some of our secondary and post-secondary students have had experience with art criticism or critique, it is a completely different beast when you are in the art museum. Suddenly you're dealing with imposing architecture, an awareness of constant surveillance, and some unspoken social rules in terms of how you might conduct yourself there versus other learning spaces. And there's also a sort of priority on the object, right? As Jason mentioned before. So we're trying to think about ways that we can decenter objects as the starting point and think about communities as the starting point instead. So dialogue with the community that is playing the game is built into the game. We start with talking about community needs rather than starting with the object. And then our third priority, or goal rather, is to distribute this using accessible tools. Again, we really hit a wall with you can download the game for free, but who's going to go to one person's website to download a free game? Based on the traffic I can see on my own website, the answer is not many people. So we had to figure out, like, if we actually want people to be able to play this game, remix this game, how do we get that out in? So we're looking at ways for players to be able to play, share, and adapt this game in ways that support their community by looking at getting this out through free web forms and also in print form. So here's expanding a little bit more on that. We're interested in kind of trying to pass the mic. So going back to sort of like who's in charge, the goal in Mantles in the Museum Counter Narratives is to decenter this sort of single person who is dictating what this game is about. So again, by centering community first and conversations first, that to some degree is going to influence how and what we look at. And we're looking at incorporating queer, decolonial, feminist, disability, and age as critical frameworks to guide not just the creation of the characters, but also to influence gameplay. And so, as I said here, the docent may not like it, but the art will thank you. So, damn the man, save the music. We're really interested in, again, sort of like thinking about how do we start with community. We want to reverse this object-centered approach to visitor engagement that art museums have been doing for decades. So before we develop the character, we're trying to encourage conversation about community needs. And this is about thinking about how art criticism flows as well. So, and thinking through, multiple ways of approaching criticism. Next slide. Again, also, we want to hit the streets, recognizing the barriers that we've already hit in terms of distribution of the game. We really wanted to prioritize the ease of access to players. We're making the game available free digital downloads and distributing it in print format in a wide array of venues. So some of what we've talked about are doing some facilitated gameplays at multiple locations and distributing the game, and also distributing it maybe just on the street, literally. So if there is one benefit to academic, to having an academic position, I often joke with my students, I have this job because I get free printing. All right. And I just want to say too that as we think about being punk, we also have to think about the role of love. Punks are not just haters, right? Punks are really interested in change and building community. And I love this photo of Erica Huggins, Black Panther organizer, because just sheer joy on her face. And this quote, I think, is very much about what Jason and I have been thinking about, that love is an expression of power, and we can use it to transform our world. As art lovers who believe that people in our communities have the power to transform art museums, we're developing this as a playful, radical method to build interest and energy in these institutional transformations. Again, we are acknowledging that we're within institutions, but also that there are limitations to being within institutions, and there are also affordances, and we're working to balance that. we're interested in your feedback, so would love to hear what you got to say. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you to all of our panelists. We have about 15 minutes here for some Q&A, and we have a couple already kind of lined up in the question and answer section in Zoom. I'm also trying to go back and forth between Zoom and Discord, so if you want to throw a question in there or in the Zoom chat, I'll try to scoop them up as best as I can. But the first question that we have is for Susan, and it's kind of a couple questions provided by different folks combined regarding the role of the GM when we're using TTRPGs in the classroom to talk about democracy. So JJ asks, do GM-less games better suit this idea? And also Joe asks, is there a possibility of a teacher who might use their role as a GM to reward certain actions or to kind of shape or bias the teaching of democracy in this setting?
So one, in terms of like the capacity of teachers to bias, absolutely. I mean, that goes without saying. I would say, so I dropped the link, and again, apologies for going over time, folks. But so I dropped a link to, this is a hyper truncated version of my dissertation. So if you want to read a hot book on the topic, with hopefully a hotter and more polished version out in about a year or two. It's in there, but there's an entire section in where I sort of dig specifically into the GM fits very well with the sort of Dewey's functional understanding of teacher, because he, while being incredibly progressive, was also kind of hypercritical of some of the counterframe that it was sort of like just free range children doing whatever with no direction, and that was a future. And so I think he threads the needle of realistic, both I think from a learning cognitive framework, but also like a systems and structures framework. So I would point to that, not just for those delicious downloads for me, but just to say that there's a lot better frame in there. I think to the point of the, does a GM-less game, structure this, I think we get back to, and this is what I love about, I think the pragmatist tradition broadly, is it holds space for the essential inbreaking of punk revolution and utopian imagining that says we have to keep kind of scrapping the system while also saying it's still Tuesday and you still got to pay your parking tickets. So how do we figure out how to make that as humane as possible? And so Dewey's understanding of government versus state, the state is a thing that would serve publics, and to a certain extent, it would be a manifestation of both publics that had found a way to structure and make permanent, essentially their approach to things. So GM-less games, I think, is a beautiful example of a space to engage a public, but the broader structure of a society that has to figure out a way to perpetuate itself beyond just the need of a public, which can dissipate and should be able to dissipate once its sort of work had been done, would point to the ways in which having someone who is still holding or sitting within the constraint and systems of powers is a better model for us for, I think, how a lot of our daily experience of governance looks like. It's not anarchist for sure, right? And there's some sadnesses about that, but there's also some very practical things that I would say we have to think about. How do we both open a space for imagination while also educate to remind people that like they still actually have a lot of power in the system that they're in, and encourage them to burn the system down too.
Thank you very much. The next question that we have is for Georg, and this is a question from Joe asking, I wonder whether you avoid applying your own stereotypes, etc., when designing a mod by perhaps enabling students to hack the game of life and work out their own changes to represent their privileges or lack thereof.
Yes, this is an excellent question. I have glossed over a lot, of course, to make this fit 15 minutes. And of course, I wouldn't want to just have my ideas which discriminations should be addressed in critical mods to be the ones that are played at the end. I think it's good to have a teacher-created critical mod as an introduction to a topic, but then to also pass the ball to one's students and see what they come up with. In my experience, I did a quantitative survey 2 years ago where we asked teachers about which issues affect their students the most, and then we also asked the students which social issues affect them the most, and the answers varied a lot. So I wouldn't want to speak for my students and the discrimination that they experience, or they want to ludify in a sense. And I've seen interesting student-led participatory research projects that try to flip that table, to let students do the brunt of the work with the teacher taking more on a moderator role.
Thank you so much. So the next question we have is from an anonymous attendee, and it's directed to Jason and Lillian. So they ask, is the decentering, or I'm sorry, is your game decentering the museum in general? Hopefully allowing the pieces in these places to have a larger cultural impact, because location plays a large role into even knowing of these pieces' existence in the first place.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a complicated question, and internationally speaking, there's different ways that different countries have approached access to public works of art. So we are working specifically in the context of the United States, and that's the main art museums are the main venue for access to the public of works of art. And so, I say we're both art lovers. I think I can speak for Jason. We're both museum lovers. But as with any toxic relationship, you have to acknowledge there's some unhealthy things in that love, and so some of what we're trying to do is not so much decenter the museum, the art museum, but to create healthy boundaries, as with any sort of relationship rebuilding, that it is sort of it is about helping museums remember that yes, sort of the official history has some role. Access to the work is important, but also that going back to what Susan's talking about too, that Dewey speaks very much about what it means to have an experience with a work of art, and it's not that you are told what it is. There are really particular ways that he talks about engagement with art that are aligned very much with this sort of idea of what it is to be a participant in democracy. I think art museums are a part of that, and they run in the United States. Art museums and public education are on parallel paths for a long time, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. We're not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as the metaphor goes.
There's a couple of other things that'll be aspects of the newer edition also to keep in mind. In the original one, the plot was decidedly from a point of privilege. Like, the characters were all influential people with the museum who were picking influential works to send to an influential show. We are not using that framework in this one. We are probably going to go at it more like, there's a imminent disaster. What do you save? The rest of it will be toast. There are other frameworks. We might supply a couple different narratives, but they're going to foreground different choices. And there's also a thing that came up in our work with the first one and in our feedback that we got from the Journal of Social Theory and Art Education, which was about disrupting the museum's power and their perspective, because a lot of people don't feel like they can have that. So one thing about that is that most museums are public places where you can go in and play our game regardless of whether or not you tell the museum you're coming, which is kind of mind-blowing, I think, for a lot of people, that you could just get a group of a couple people together and just go and be playing a LARP in the museum, and hey, there you go. So being upfront about that. And also, really, this can be played anytime you have a collection of visual artifacts that is in some way relevant. Up to a certain point, you would have to adapt some of the characters in the play, but it's it's got the potential to be more versatile than we originally designed it.
Thanks, y'all. This last question in the Q&A box is also from an anonymous attendee, and I think it's applicable, and I'm curious to hear from each of the panelists about this question. So the question is, if a democracy needs an educated people, does the education need to be factually or morally good? Can a democracy built on corrupt education function? And are we living in a corrupt educational democracy? Just a real like light and easy, fluffy question to end the panel with here. But please, anyone who feels drawn to that question, I'd love to hear any of these panelists take it on.
Yeah, education is democracy and democracy is education. At least that was Dewey's absolute core framework, that the experience of things that are educative are ultimately and educative in his sense that they regenerative and they opened pathways. That is what led us to democracy, whether that was formally in schooling or in an educational environment. And so anything that shuts that down is again would be corrupt in the rest of it. I think to the point of like what is true and morally good, where Dewey's pragmatism helps us, and we had some comments too in the chat about like what's the helpful role of the expert, especially when we think about like the public and its problems coming out of the Dewey-Lippmann debate, is we can hold expertise, but it is always in conversation with lived experience of people, and that's never pushed away. I think Dewey was doing some really interesting like what we would call epistemic justice work, right? And so his famous line was, the shoemaker is the man who best knows how to make the shoes, but the man who wears them best knows where they pinch. Right. And so are those in conversation? If they are not, like, so I think over and above the are we stuck in this space, I think this has to beg the question of how are we claiming this knowledge and truth and where is it coming from and how are we bringing that in? Which is where I think ludic exercise, play, and the rest of it is an incredible way to continue to bring all of this lived knowledge that we hold within ourselves into the conversation.
I think we could probably all speak to that question at length. Morality is a shifting thing, but I think any educational framework needs to be repeatedly interrogated and re-interrogated. Like if we took what was moral in the 70s or 80s and we were still using it today, then it would not be moral anymore. So it always needs re-examined. It needs to come back to, and that's the nature of it, is that it is in process. I would say the most amoral and the wrong choice is to try to make things go back to a pre-existing state of thought or morality. That would be one, mostly very, very difficult, and two, extremely oppressive, which brings us into the Freire there, where Freire's point of view is that education is the primary tool to escape oppression. Now, in terms of what we're dealing with right now, it can be hard to say because there's an awful lot of moving pieces. But I would say that it's not currently corrupt unless all you are consuming is messages from an authoritarian source. The teachers are resisting, depending on the where you're looking. There is punk all around us. Authoritarianism takes power by making you think you are alone, by isolating you. That's one of the reasons education is resistance to it. But I will tell you that I know that there's so many people who are actively resisting and pushing against the attempts to corrupt the system that it is, at least as of yet, not a corrupt system.
Yeah, I think that I just want to piggyback on that really fast to say, we both work with pre-service educators, and I, regularly I will have students ask, why does education keep changing? We just got used to these standards. We're doing new state standards and new national standards are coming out. Like, why are we now implementing this or that? And to the point of sort of like, what is this role to be responsive? I've told students, like, education by nature has to continue to change because society changes, and part of being able to provide potential for democracy in that sort of the lived cultural space of a classroom, which is its own culture. You know, each classroom is its own culture. Each class period, when you're teaching in secondary and post-secondary, is, you know, it is about being responsive to that community and conditions and adapting and changing. And so I think like there's a sort of a misunderstanding for folks who are outside of education. Does educate, you know, why are you, you know, like, why is this in constant flux? And that is seen as an error, but it is actually baked into what we do as a way to be responsive to the changing conditions and to continue to provide substrate for those democratic experiences.
I think it might be a kind of special pleading to attribute any kind of inherent morality to systems like education, or in my case, speech education, or game design, or gameplay, right? At least students resist the notion that these things are anything but instrumental. So to the extent that we, say, no, there's an ethos of games, or an ethos of speech, or an ethos of teaching that, of learning, that's, fundamentally grounded in a moral system. You get students saying, no, just tell me what I can use. How am I going to use this to do the thing that I want to do, which may or may not, be grounded in the same system of morals or ethics. And so that's I raise that as an interesting tension that I see in a lot of different discourses.
All right. I believe that we have reached time. So please, as always, keep the conversation going in the Discord. Thank you again to all of these amazing panelists. I really enjoyed each paper and the ways that they kind of spoke and to each other and interwove with each other. And so thank you all so much. Please, everyone, if you are so inclined, return in about a half an hour for the next panel, which is on punk, sex, and gender. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much.